It's been an amazing day, and to learn from such fantastic colleagues, and to be in a conversation that is something that I think we all really care about, which is the state of human rights. I mean, I think today it's no shock to say that the human rights system, including its norms and institutions, are under immense strain. Neoliberalism and now neo-illiberalism, as it's been termed, have undone the liberal settlement, unleashing regimes around the world that are trampling on basic rights with expulsions, genocide, and extraction, all of which human rights have seemed powerless to stop. And as we watch this liberal settlement sunsetting, without a new order yet born in its place, what are we to do as human rights researchers? Are we to carry on sort of prefiguring a human rights order as if it weren't being destroyed? That is, by empirically documenting human rights violations or generating doctrinal analyses to challenge court decisions? Or must we transform our modes of scholarly research to produce forms of knowledge that can support a new generation of human rights? In my talk today, I'm going to advocate for the latter. I'm going to suggest that our disciplinary and interdisciplinary methods and frames of research are inadequate for our current conjuncture. And instead, I'm going to argue for a transdisciplinary approach to human rights research. So, there we go. So the concept of transdisciplinarity is often distinguished from interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinary research in that it seeks to transcend or move beyond disciplines through a more holistic and problem-centered approach to knowledge production. Transdisciplinarity recognizes the legitimacy of multiple forms of knowledge, including not only knowledge coming out of different disciplines, but also local, indigenous, professional, experiential, and sensory knowledge. It approaches knowledge with epistemic pluralism and ontological pluralism. And it seeks to integrate these forms of knowledge to generate knowledge that is explicitly oriented towards addressing complex challenges and facilitating social and ecological transformation. And so today we spoke a little bit about how you might start from theory or method, and transdisciplinarity really starts from the problem. So my own journey towards transdisciplinarity is the result of learning from my research interlocutors. So over the past decade, my research has focused, as Bashak just said, on the human rights of small-scale food producers, including farmers and fisher folk, peasants, indigenous peoples, and other people working in rural areas. And through ethnographic research, I trained as a legal anthropologist, I really sought to understand how these movements have reimagined human rights, and specifically the right to food, from the ground up through this claim of food sovereignty that was articulated first by La Via Campesina, the international peasant movement in the 1990s, and has had a huge transformative effect by really reshaping the way we understand the right to food from a sort of top-down distributive perspective to a claim for a more democratic right for food producers and those who are food insecure to shape their own food and agricultural systems. And I've studied how they've used this vision to shape transnational food and agricultural governance. Now, core to these movements' vision of transformation is this idea called agroecology. This is what is often referred to as a transdisciplinary science, social movement, and practice all at once. And this concept of agroecology has sought to shift the relationship between science and society towards a more explicitly value-laden approach to science that can facilitate a more just and democratic approach to socio-ecological transformation. So through agroecology, movements for food sovereignty have moved beyond simply just advocating for norms or regulatory frameworks that shape food systems to address the very systems of knowledge production through which transformation is actually understood. And it's from my experience studying these movements and joining these movements that I've begun to embrace transdisciplinarity in my own work. So today I'm going to explore the possibilities and tensions that transdisciplinarity raises for human rights research by drawing on my current research, which looks at the intersections of digital rights and peasants' rights and the right to food. And digital rights have really emerged as this important and growing field as digital technologies have emerged at the frontier of capitalist accumulation. So the expanding power of just a handful of corporations concentrated in North America, as well as the computational and generalist or generative AI, are really illuminating the limits of existing articulations of human rights oriented specifically around privacy and digital access. So in response, movements, including the food sovereignty movements with whom I work, are coalescing to challenge the power of big tech and re-articulating what human rights scholar Matthias Riese has provocatively termed fourth-generation rights, or epistemic rights that seek to protect human intelligence, autonomy, and dignity. And so in my talk, as I'll describe, digital rights really offer this important space for the development of transdisciplinary approaches to human rights. On the one hand, the technical operation and affordances of digital technologies have profound socio-political effects that necessitate the integration of different forms of technical, social, and legal knowledge to really analyze human rights violations and harms produced by digital technologies. On the other hand, given that there's a greater need to incorporate the knowledges and experiences of rights holders through practices of co-production and participatory research. So today I'm going to describe how transdisciplinary approaches really offer a framework for expanding human rights beyond existing meanings and frameworks. So I'm going to start by discussing my research on digital rights before elaborating a little bit about the meaning of transdisciplinarity, especially in the context of human rights. And then I'm going to describe two practical aspects of transdisciplinary methodologies to co-produce knowledge: the integration of disciplinary forms of knowledge, which I've already talked about, and the use of participatory methodologies, and think about how they can be applied to the study of digital rights, drawing on some of the work I've done. And I'll wrap up by just elaborating some of the tensions and obstacles of transdisciplinary human rights research, which I'd really like to have a conversation about, but why I think transdisciplinarity will remain a difficult but necessary transition. So digital rights are emerging as not only as one of the most important fields of human rights, but a critical arena of social struggle. So once they were primarily concerned with individual privacy and access to digital services. But as digital infrastructures have become this primary form of extractivism and accumulation, that is from socio-ecological data that's at the backbone of carbon markets to large language models that are now being deployed by militaries and the private sector to establish new forms of power and control, movements around the world are drawing on the language of rights to address issues of surveillance, inequality, and ecological degradation. So in May of this year, I was in Lusaka, Zambia, for such a convergence that brought together social movements fighting for the expansion of data centers, indigenous communities struggling against mining, the minerals on which digital technologies depend, as well as small-scale farmers and peasants who are the targets of digital technology and agrarian transformation, particularly on the African continent. And I was there with the latter group, the peasant movements, with whom I've been working for the past 4 years to address the risks of digital agricultural technologies and the risks they pose to their livelihoods and land. And these technologies range from drones and satellite-based remote sensing to mobile phone applications that provide advisory services to farmers. And these have really become the newest technology, a long history of technology, introduced to food producers with the claim of increasing their productivity. So they follow really a century in which external technologies, whether we're talking about tractors, whether we're talking about genetically modified seeds, that have really driven the industrialization of agriculture, and with it land degradation and concentration, greenhouse gas emissions, as well as widespread dispossession and the remaining problem of food insecurity. So the digital agricultural revolution, as it's called by the World Bank, and here you see a photo of it, promises to really enhance productivity as well as address some of the risks of overuse of agrochemicals and synthetic fertilizers. But with these network-based technologies also come all of these new forms of surveillance and control that are exerted both by governments as well as the private sector, because core to these technologies is the collection of massive amounts of data that make food producers and their land newly legible to outside actors. So small-scale food producers are therefore mobilizing to contest the extraction of their data and the coercive deployment of tech to really facilitate commercialization and depeasantization. So the convening in Lusaka, which was called Earth Keepers versus AI, had been planned to take place right before RightsCon, an annual gathering of digital rights activists, but it was actually canceled due to Chinese influence, we were told, but which activists at the Earth Keeper Summit had actively sought to influence. It was actually this amazing summit that was pulled together just in the span of a few months with the idea that this was going to really try and open up the conversation around digital rights beyond the way they'd been framed. And so activists really wanted to move beyond these sort of issues of privacy to address the broader structural dynamics of digital technologies, and especially their ecological and epistemic effects. And their choice to focus their efforts on their arena of human rights activism is not necessarily a given. I mean, in my research, I was looking at food sovereignty as really an alternative framing to the right to food. And Kari Pennin and Uto Puko have noted that the language of rights is not the only possible strategy or normative framework for approaching the principles that should guide the future development and governance of the internet and digital media. Critical legal scholars, as we know, have long emphasized that dominant forms of rights are not only individualistic and anthropocentric, but have often served as a handmaiden to neoliberalism. And concepts such as digital colonialism, data sovereignty, and data justice have all emerged as these really important frameworks to address structural dynamics of digital power. But as Siddharth D'Souza writes, digital rights operate as this critical epistemic site through which struggles around datafication are articulated, claims are formulated, grievances are understood, and collective action is taken. So they inform the understanding of what makes the concept of data justice work as it travels across different locations. So as movements identify human rights as a strategic framework in an arena of struggle, what's the role and responsibility of human rights scholars in our field? Human rights scholarship has generally been characterized by two approaches, I would say. The first is doctrinal approaches, which we talked about today, which really seek to elaborate the law's meaning and application by drawing on disciplinary frameworks and methods of legal scholarship. And doctrinal approaches often aim to, in their most critical and sort of human rights sense, extend legal protection, but come with the risk of centering the legal scholar's voice with the dangers of co-optation, de-radicalization, and colonial reinterpretation. Now, on the other hand, interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary socio-legal scholarship take a more empirical approach to studying how movements articulate rights. They look at translation, mobilization, and how rights are made into legal consciousness, as we've talked about today, but in the service of understanding the socio-political dynamics of law. And such an approach centers the voices and perspectives of activists and social movements, but at the expense of separating the subject from the object and ultimately speaking primarily to scholarly elites. And by contrast, transdisciplinary scholarship offers a third option that can potentially overcome the limits of both. So, transdisciplinarity. The concept of transdisciplinarity is often credited to Jean Piaget, but it was elaborated primarily in the 1990s and 2000s, and it's often described as transcending disciplines and breaking with traditional modes of Western science rooted in Enlightenment thinking. And this mode of knowledge production is rooted in this distinction between subject and object, a framework in which scientists are distinct from and able to understand scientific objects through empirical study. So transdisciplinarians describe this as mode one of producing knowledge. And by contrast, rather than understanding the world as holding a single objective and verifiable truth, it really seeks to understand reality as plural, what transdisciplinary scholars call mode two science. And given this recognition of pluralism, transdisciplinary science aims to co-create knowledge through engagement with different disciplinary and practice-based communities. So in contrast to traditional disciplinary approaches that have been rooted in an instrumental understanding of scientific and technological development, transdisciplinary approaches are really oriented around problem solving. And to do this, transdisciplinary science takes as its starting point not research questions rooted in fragmented and siloed forms of disciplinary knowledge, but rather concrete problems faced by humans and nature. And it calls for integrating different forms of knowledge in addressing such problems. So Eve Darian-Smith and Phil McCarty write that such an approach is potentially emancipatory and that it explicitly seeks to free up our ways of thinking and our organization of knowledge in the academy by incorporating Western and non-Western thinking into a more holistic approach to pressing contemporary issues. And in some ways, it's very related to the decolonial turn that we're increasingly seeing within universities. So transdisciplinarity has really spawned a bunch of new fields: sustainability sciences, human ecology, agroecology, and other fields. And it's generated a lot of theoretical scholarship. But its application to law and human rights has been limited. And one reason is that the commitment to doctrinal methods and legal positivism within legal research remain a really important source of symbolic power for legal scholars and practitioners and legal authority. Doctrinal methods and legal positivism insulate legal scholars and practitioners from being critiqued as activists or imbuing their own moral beliefs into legal interpretation. And in international human rights law, anthropologists like Julie Biot have shown how UN institutions labor exhaustively to produce neutral and authoritative reports to also shield themselves from political critique. Now, law and society, or socio-legal studies, developed to challenge these doctrinal approaches to legal scholarship, emphasizing the need for empirical research to enable legal reform. And in the 1980s and 1990s, when social scientists sought to break away from positivist research by incorporating interpretive methodologies and analysis, many legal scholars pushed back. And today, there's really a significant conflict over the modes of empiricism acceptable, especially within the legal academy. Conservative legal movements in the US, for example, have pushed for the creation of a new field called empirical legal studies, which seeks to narrow the scope of empiricism to quantitative approaches drawn from economics and other disciplines that embrace rational choice frameworks. And today, we also see this happening in Europe. While legal scholarship is becoming increasingly open to empirical approaches, they often remain narrow and quantitative. But neither approach will ultimately address what Christina Elena Popotash and her colleagues have described as the epistemological crisis of legal scholarship. And they explain that this crisis has emerged as the result of a pluralization of the forms of legality. So they write the plurality of sources of law, soft law, treaties, AI-generated law. In fact, recently, the South African AI proposed regulation was itself found to be written by AI. But the decline of central authority, the nation state and exclusive sovereignty, the invasion of technology in the normative space, whether we're talking about blockchain and code, cultural and post-colonial claims, and the crisis of legitimacy and democratic representation, they write, really all demand that legal epistemology be reconfigured not as an academic tool, but as an ontological adaptation mechanism. So human rights is probably the most fertile ground for transdisciplinary scholarship to take hold because the epistemic crisis of legal scholarship that Popotash describes is also an urgent political crisis. And transdisciplinary approaches address these in two ways. And the first is by integrating different forms of expertise to understand shifting forms of legality. And this is particularly important as law and state power are reconfigured around emerging forms of infrastructural power, which I'll talk about. So the rise of private power via digital infrastructures is leading global legal scholars to increasingly advocate for thinking infrastructurally about law, which requires new ways of thinking about human rights. And second, as infrastructural forms of power remake the conditions for human rights, they raise new normative questions about the meaning and values of human rights in a digital age, particularly as distrust of experts rises and liberal legal modes of thought face declining legitimacy. Transdisciplinary approaches really encourage us to co-produce knowledge with communities and integrate their voices and knowledge into our research. So I'll describe using participatory research methods not only to generate more original and accurate insights, but also to generate shared analysis through which the once objects of human rights actively become the subjects of transformation. So first, to talk about the shifting forms of legality. one of the primary forces propelling transdisciplinarity is changing forms of law. And today, it's widely recognized that global legal pluralism is not just an analytical framework, it's a reality of global legal systems. And beyond the recognized sources of law, of legal pluralism that transnational legal scholars have studied, from contract law to private codes of conduct, scholars are really beginning to hone in on infrastructure as one of the most important sources of legality. So over the past century, infrastructure has primarily consisted of public works that were central to the construction of the liberal state. But recently, a lot of fields of social sciences have converged on infrastructure as an important object of study for at least 3 reasons. The first is just the widespread privatization of infrastructure under neoliberalism. So water services, public housing, agricultural marketing boards, education, they're all examples of services that were privatized beginning in the 80s and 90s. The second reason really relates to the politicization of development financing for infrastructure, particularly with the rise of China as a major financer. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, is the rise of digital capitalism as a site of geostrategic competition and power. So competition to control digital infrastructures and networks has led scholars to describe sovereignty itself as increasingly infrastructural. Europe, the US, India, China, among many others, all have elaborated their own approaches to assert control over digital infrastructures, which can range from data to software to hardware to chips to undersea cables. And right now we're seeing this shift from territorial to infrastructural forms of sovereignty. So scholars in the field of anthropology and science and technology studies, or STS, have been really at the forefront of understanding the social and political effects of infrastructures, which are often referred to as socio-technical affordances. And although they're often framed as really technical infrastructures, we found that infrastructures have profound impacts on human and more than human relations. So for example, the work by Antina von Schnitzler on water privatization in South Africa, or Catherine Fennell on the privatization of social housing in Chicago, reveals not only the distributive effects of privatization, but also the ways in which they've transformed everyday relations, expectations of the state, and social practices of calculation. And legal anthropology has also looked at particularly how water infrastructures have illuminated the specific ways in which infrastructures mediate human rights. So for example, in her work on water infrastructures in Costa Rica, Andrea Ballestero shows how mathematical formulas through which water rates are set operate as what she calls a technical space of ethics, a space in which human rights intersect with financial logics of water distribution in ways that require a lot of technical understanding. So anthropological attention to these social and regulatory dynamics of infrastructures have led legal scholars in turn to begin considering the relationship between law and infrastructures. So Benedict Kingsbury, who's one of the most important scholars of thinking infrastructurally, he says that in crude simplification, infrastructure may be a means of implementing law or of enabling law. It can be a substitute for law or displace law. It may be an obstacle to law or prevent law, or interact pathologically with law. It shapes juridical relations and imaginaries. Infrastructure creates dependencies, engenders cooperation, and structural conflict. In his study of global security law and the use of algorithmic decision-making, Gavin Sullivan, in the UK border policies, Gavin Sullivan has advanced this thinking, and he uses the term infralegalities in his recognition of the important regulatory work that digital infrastructures do. And he argues that by analyzing the socio-technical affordances of infralegalities, that is how our design of our technological objects and the socio-technical environment condition and constrain possibility for actions by subjects. And this requires both unpacking the technical aspects of how these devices work, combined with the social practices they generate, including how they reshape the possibility for legal accountability. So a growing number of scholars have really converged around 2 areas in which the relationship between law and infrastructures are reconfiguring human rights. One is digital welfare states, and another one is the digitalization of borders. And in both arenas, we see how the consolidation of public and private data infrastructures and the use of algorithmic decision-making has profound effects on the ability of individuals to access public benefits and across borders. And this really requires rethinking human rights from an infrastructural perspective. That is, by deploying the core elements of a human rights-based approach, such as issues of inequality and representativeness and equitable use, privacy, and benefit sharing in ways that require this complex technical knowledge. So in my research, the infrastructuralization of digital power has had significant impacts on the human right to food. And a clear example that I found is that activists are having trouble articulating the ways they have faced articulating rights to address digital harms. So early in my research, 4 years ago, a common way that movements started to frame their claims was that they should own their data. But as movements have grown increasingly doubtful about the technical feasibility and the desirability of owning this data, they were really drawing on sort of a proprietary notion of data, a proprietary notion that's really embedded in sort of liberal legal ideology. They've tried to find other ways of thinking about this. Elettra Bietti has argued that actually thinking about data as property makes little sense, given that data is hardly ever a discrete object that can be separated from other data, owned by one individual at a time, or easily separated and exchanged. So she argues that it's only by understanding data as an infrastructure that it can be governed. In other words, a human rights-based approach in the context of digital agriculture can't be simply about rights over data. It can't be a simple translation as such. It requires adapting rights frameworks to infrastructural frameworks of data extraction. So thinking infrastructurally about rights requires more than legal knowledge. It requires understanding the data semantics, exchange standards that commensurate data, along with the protocols and application program interfaces through which data is exchanged, the algorithms through which predictions are made, and addressing these issues requires insights from anthropology, from legal scholarship, computer sciences. It's really only by integrating such knowledges that we can understand, for example, how data is or is not anonymized to prevent triangulated identification, how data exchange protocols facilitate or prevent data sharing, and how algorithmic bias may operate. In other words, it enables a better understanding of the affordances of these infrastructures, but also the needs for accountability and emerging dynamics of rights. But we can't simply integrate these forms of expertise. It also requires other forms of knowledge, other forms of knowledge including governments and private actors involved in the design of these systems, as well as rights holders and the people served by these systems. Really, without engaging rights holders in the design of these processes, there's a danger that any solutions we design will not actually solve the problems, but actually exacerbate them. Because one of the key critiques of human rights, especially from the majority world, has been that human rights largely reflect the interest of wealthy countries, donors, and institutions, but not the concerns faced by people. So this really points us to the second dimension of transdisciplinary approaches, which is participatory methods. And this is a picture that was put together by Lydia Kempton, an undergraduate at University of Edinburgh that I worked with. So perhaps the most important tenet of transdisciplinary research is the integration of forms of knowledge. And they're not only focused on individual disciplines, but as I've said, that scientific research is itself epistemically limited. So it works to integrate different forms of knowledge, including local and practice-based forms of knowledge. So in food systems, for example, transdisciplinary approaches integrate knowledges from agronomy, sociology, economics, and law, along with the practical knowledge of food producers to think about the complex social, ecological, and economic dimensions. And this is referred to as transdisciplinary co-production. Co-production is really labor-intensive. So as Merit Polk describes, it requires more than just bringing stakeholders into the scientific realm as advisors, informants, or users. It engages with practitioners and researchers in the entire knowledge production process, including joint problem formulation, knowledge generation, and application both in the scientific and real-world contexts, mutual quality control of scientific rigor, social robustness, and effectiveness. And transdisciplinary researchers' commitment to co-production speaks to values wider than science. The concern, especially with social robustness, which is a term that's often used, has led multiple scholars to emphasize how justice and all its components within transdisciplinary projects are also brought to the foreground. So Stephanie Burkhardt and Florina Schneider have described transdisciplinary knowledge production as a framework for epistemic justice. Human rights scholars have really long engaged with rights holders. But the depth of participation in the research process is often limited. And this is because participation within human rights is often geared towards action research, which is research that focuses on social action, policy reform, or other types of systemic change. Cesar Rodriguez Garavito, for example, describes how engaging with rights holders allows one to see the same social reality from different angles, and how the design of research is often directly informed by the interactions with actors on the ground. But participatory action research is often distinguished from action research because it seeks to break the monopoly on who holds knowledge for whom social research should be undertaken by explicitly collaborating with marginalized or vulnerable others. And this has really important implications for human rights, especially given that critiques, as I've said, associated with third world approaches to international law, or TWAIL, have identified the monopoly of human rights interpretation as a key force for ongoing coloniality, as Kenyan scholar Makau Mutua has described, that it continues to reproduce these civilizational hierarchies. So while participatory action research have arguably always been engaged with the field of human rights, it's really only recently that human rights scholars have explicitly engaged with the practice of participatory action research and transdisciplinary co-production. And one of the fields in which we've seen this emerge the strongest is in the field of digital rights. In her research, for example, on the field of digital rights in the context of health, Sarah Davis has pioneered this participatory action research across Bangladesh, Colombia, Ghana, Kenya, and Vietnam. It's super impressive. And one of the reasons that she describes the importance of participatory action research is simply the pace at which digital technologies are developing. She explains that it positions civil society groups with the information they need to begin addressing problems immediately without waiting for academic publication timelines. Now, another reason that participatory action approaches are necessary is as a result of the entanglement between law and infrastructures. As law becomes increasingly technical, as it stops appearing as traditionally recognized law, participatory action research can reveal its distributive and relational functions while also reimagining rights from below. So in my research on digital agricultural technologies, I've tried to use participatory action research to both enable immediate action by civil society as well as to collectively reimagine human rights. In 2023, I conducted a participatory action research with a farmers network in Kenya to understand how small-scale farmers were responding to digital technologies as well as their concerns. And after receiving funding from a Dutch Research Council, we split the grant and we set out to really understand how in one county digital technologies were being used. And we made several visits to this county with my co-researcher here, Gideon Muya, and we sought to really understand how they were being developed as well as to understand farmers' concerns. And during our fieldwork, we really documented how farmers were using digital technologies. Farmers with little knowledge of the socio-technical or legal infrastructures that enable digital technologies identified a wide range of concerns, many related to how their data was being extracted and used without their knowledge. So farmers were really the constant source of data extraction. And they were particularly concerned about how it could be used to grab their land. So in 2024, for example, the government contracted young people throughout the country to carry out a digital survey of farmers through a national farmer registry, which included questions about land ownership and young people actually walking around capturing the GPS coordinates of their land without knowing. And this registry is now a critical building block in what's now being described as digital public infrastructure, which is a collection of registries and data exchange frameworks that the Kenyan state's developing to share with the private sector to really facilitate the digital economy. So once we completed our research, we presented our findings and organized a technology assessment of civil society and farmers organizations. And beyond the concerns identified by farmers, civil society also raised concerns about the inherent bias in these technologies. Many agricultural technologies are designed to provide agricultural advice, but it's not transparent what kind of advice they provide. For example, whether they are paid to promote certain kinds of inputs and whether they're even accurate from small-scale farmers who grow in diverse polycultures. And the replacement of traditional extension officers with these technologies, combined with their targeting at youth, led civil society to worry that such technologies would ultimately erode local, collective, and indigenous forms of knowledge, which is an important shield of autonomy and agency for small-scale food producers. So after we collected these risks and the limits of, we really started to see the limits of existing grammars of digital rights. So during a workshop, a representative from Kenya's Office of Data Protection presented on their 2019 Data Privacy Act. And one of the things that most farmers realized is that while privacy was important, particularly around land data, it really failed to address collective epistemic rights. So in response, and this is the report we wrote from this, in response, Kenyan farmers are not only reframing how they think about their rights, but they've also started to build their own digital infrastructures that help them consider what types of legal and regulatory frameworks can serve to support their autonomy and dignity. In other words, and they've begun to translate or vernacularize human rights, in the words of Sally Mary, into a process of socio-technical infrastructure building. And last year, the Farmers Network I worked with received a grant to create a local hub a digital hub for local and indigenous agroecological knowledge, in which they're collecting stories, recipes, and information about seeds to be shared with their networks. And in doing so, they've really identified multiple aspects of human rights that go beyond privacy. And these include a voice in how data is collected and with whom. And they've really sought to not simply implement human rights, but construct infrastructures that protect their epistemic rights. And while this example really focuses on digital technologies, the use of participatory methods is not limited to infrastructural legalities, digital or otherwise. Scholars have begun to integrate our participatory action research into their legal research. They've consistently emphasized that what they may start out focusing on, such as legal gaps perceived by legal scholars, are widened to address the larger structural and political and economic factors that are often really elided by such narrow legal focuses. This isn't a weakness of PAR methods. Rather, it really provides a framework for rethinking rights amid today's shifting forms of power and forms of legality. So, wrapping up. Transdisciplinary approaches are really not without their tensions, and they generally challenge existing forms of knowledge production and their institutional organization, but two specific challenges really prevent them from becoming more established. The first is the tension between existing modes of legal legitimacy and more expansive modes of legal analysis and advocacy. So as I described earlier, doctrinal modes of research have had a hard time accepting the incorporation of empirical methods. And this is especially true in the continental tradition, which is more adherent to positivist approaches to law. When empirical methods are accepted, many legal scholars really subscribe to outdated positive notions of research that value objectivity and separation of the researcher from their object of study. Transdisciplinary approaches really challenge that assumption and the historic claims to legitimacy, not only because they acknowledge contemporary understandings of politics of knowledge production, but also because of the incorporation of non-expert forms of knowledge. I'm sure that others have shared this experience of being told that participatory approaches is activism and not law. But it is activism, but not in the sense that I've been told. It's activism in the sense that it seeks to reshape dominant legal epistemologies, producing knowledge not around abstract legal categories, but grounded in local knowledge. And the result is that the meaning of rights can become rooted in what are often failing models of legal protection, but actually in popular claims and understandings of people. And in challenging existing modes of legal knowledge, transdisciplinary approaches offer a new vision for legal realism, or what Austrian legal scholar Eugene Ehrlich once called living law. So Popatash argues that legal transdisciplinarity is a way of thinking law as a living science, embodied in the universe of meanings that's in constant renegotiation. So in this moment, as the liberal settlement's being offered in mind, it offers a path towards legal renewal. And the second tension is really more practical. Transdisciplinary approaches really run counter to the ways in which knowledge production is organized in the modern university. We're here in Germany, where many of the disciplinary distinctions of the modern university were born. Disciplines are the ways in which rewards and recognition are distributed in academia. And Middleman and Esser emphasize that disciplines continue to provide ontological security and rewards to those who follow established paths of knowledge generation. Innovation is encouraged insofar as it does not challenge institutionalized rationales of validity. Transdisciplinary research can be illegible to colleagues in our disciplinary departments, not only because it doesn't fit disciplinary standards, but also because publications may not take the form of academic articles. Participatory action research are geared towards generating community knowledge rather than academic knowledge, which can mean translating them into academic publications can actually be difficult. For more established scholars, this may be less of a problem, but for early career scholars, this is a major challenge. And this tension points to really important responsibilities of more senior scholars in making space for transdisciplinary research. But it also implies really a broader need, both within the social sciences and law, of reassessing existing forms of knowledge production and their relevance to our current political conjuncture. And this is likely to be a major struggle, but I think that human rights research offers an important space of experimentation, especially given the state of human rights today. Digital rights are just one arena in which such approaches are taking hold, but transdisciplinary research can be used to investigate many other domains of rights which are being undermined and reimagined today. And transdisciplinary approaches move us past these sort of idealistic and discursive approaches to focusing on complex problems and solutions that could involve the greater implementation of rights. But more significantly, by co-producing human rights knowledge with rights holders, they support rights holders in mobilizing for a more expansive vision of human rights from below. Thank you.